And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Before we jump into the episode, I'd like to just give a quick update, a couple of housekeeping items, let you know what I've been up to over the last couple of months. So you haven't heard from us since June. I believe we released the last episode 71, beginning of summer. And here we are, mid-August now. I've been kind of stepping away, making some life changes. So we're in the process of buying a farm in the middle of nowhere, old dirt road in the country, and moving out there full time over the next few months. We're going to take our time packing up, moving, selling our current place, etc. But really excited to make that transition. For those of you who caught the last episode, you know that the thing that's been top of the list and top of mind for me in terms of interest and study has been nature, getting back to nature, trying to glean the lessons that we can learn from nature, and just trying to put a Band-Aid over this brutal separation that modern culture has had from nature. I believe with a deep conviction that man was made not just to live on the earth, but to live in and with the earth. And I know, at least in my personal life and from the life of others I observe around me, there seems to be a schism, a dichotomy, or a breaking point that happened over the last few generations for a plethora of reasons. Technology, modern convenience being near the top of that list, but many things have led us more inward, and by inward I mean indoors, literally away from God's creation. And that's something I want to fix. And to fix that, obviously, I can only begin by fixing what I can control, and that's my life and the life of my family. So we made an offer on a farm. This is a full-scale, fully operational, homestead type farm, and just kind of fell into our lap. The timing worked out. It truly, in every sense of the word, feels like a godsend. So we'll be making that leap, and that's one of the reasons why you haven't really heard from me in the last few weeks, is I've really been preoccupied with that. Additionally, I kind of just haven't had the muse to want to record. Forgive me if this sounds cynical, but I've kind of become cynical, for lack of a better word, when it comes to podcasting and just putting myself out there in any sort of forum in general. YouTubing, it all just seems vain, I guess, for a lack of a better word. I mean, in 2021, it feels like everybody either has a podcast or an OnlyFans. And that's, not really hyperbole. I think there's some truth to that. When I started this in 2017, podcasting wasn't new by any means. I started listening to my first podcasts. I think I found Jim Harold's Paranormal Podcast in 2006, 2007, and Dan Carlin's Hardcore History around the same time. And then I was on my way. It was a wide open world at that point. And even at 2017, I dragged my heels for years before I actually decided to do my own podcast. And I think that was only to keep my own sanity. It was my way of sort of journaling, or, keeping a diary, I guess, in my own way, of thoughts and ideas. But now, just a few years later, literally every major media corporation and every Joe with a microphone has his own podcast now. And that kind of pushes me away from it. I've always kind of just been a contrarian. When the masses are going one way, I tend to want to go the other. Doesn't mean I want to walk away from the podcast. Doesn't mean Eschaton's going away. It just means that it's going to be handled much more casually going forward. So please don't unsubscribe to the feed. Don't think that the podcast is going away by any means. But I'm really just going to record when I have the muse, when I feel like it going forward. And if I don't for long stretches of time, then I won't. With that said, I will no longer be charging or accepting Patreon support for the podcast. I'm not going to charge listeners for a podcast that I'm not doing 100% of the time, or doing on at least a 3-week, 4-week schedule like we have been. I may keep to that timeline, but regardless, even if I put out more content and start putting stuff out every week, I'm not going to charge patrons anymore. I do appreciate that support, and it allowed us to market the show a little bit, but those are things that philosophically I just think are futile now. So I don't really want to put any more of your money or my own into marketing the podcast. If it grows organically, great. But that's the only way it's going to happen, because we'll no longer be charging patrons their pledge amount for future releases. For those of you who have supported the show through PayPal donations, then you know who you are. There's a couple of you. I do not have control to cease those. So if you're hearing this, please, do that at your own discretion. But I can't automatically put the pause on those like I can with the Patreon donations. So please do at your convenience. And going forward, this is going to be kind of on an ad hoc basis, but I will release content when I feel like I have something worth saying and something worth sharing with the world. You can count on that, but I won't be putting out material just for the sake of putting out material. I don't think it's the best use of my time or yours, to be quite frank. So I'm not somebody who's just going to talk for the sake of talking. Beyond that, as we make the actual move to the farm and into the wilderness over the months ahead, there may be a period of time where it goes radio silent for a little while as I migrate everything and then try to get things up and running in a new place with new sounds, new audio, and maybe the podcast is due for a refresh all around, guys. So I was thinking of that. So in this quiet period while I'm making that transition over the winter months coming up, if you guys have ideas for the podcast, for example, I'm thinking about putting in new audio, new intro on the front end, possibly on the back end, maybe restructuring the show a little bit. If you guys got samples or clips, if anybody out there is a musician, if you want to send me something, I'd be happy to listen to it and consider, utilizing it in a future version 2.0 of Eschaton, if you'd be so kind to share that with me. Otherwise, I may just go my own route and use my lack of creativity to try to find something that appeals to the audience. But these are just some ideas I've been batting around. So anyway, those are some general updates. In a more personal sense, my family's been really taking a beating over the last year. A lot of deaths in the family, especially on my wife's side. None of them, surprisingly, COVID related. Just a bad year. A lot of people passed away for various reasons, and that's been tough. So keep us in your thoughts and prayers in that regard. Maybe that's also contributed to distraction, and maybe my heart not being in it, but just want to be transparent with you guys as I always try to be. But rest assured, if you take away nothing else from that, Eschaton is not going away. It may just be a little bit more irregular, but I will try to keep up my end of the bargain when I say that the episodes and content we do release will be valuable, interesting, a fresh take, things that you probably haven't heard elsewhere, and I will try to make it worth your while. And if I don't feel like it's going to check those boxes, then I'll just keep it to myself. Now, let's get into today's episode. So I want to kind of piggyback on where we left off in the last episode, metempsychosis and natural religion. We're going to leave, for the most part, the metempsychosis piece behind. Do with that what you will. I hope you guys found that interesting and that you were able to go down some of those rabbit trails on your own and look into not only the ancient takes, which we covered in the podcast on metempsychosis or reincarnation, but some of the modern interpretations and psychological studies that are being done at the academic level as well. But I'd like to hone in more on the natural concept of that title in the previous episode. I called it natural religion. Religion's a loaded word, but if I had to describe it as anything, and if I were to call myself a religious person in any sense, this is what I'm referring to. You'll never hear me call myself religious in the sense that I observe a set of core tenets or dogmas, which religions tend to do. I come from a Judeo-Christian background. I do believe in Jesus Christ in the sense of, Messiah and personal Savior, but that's really where my affiliation with Christianity dies. I don't really consider myself a Christian anymore. And I know that's a hard thing to try to materialize into a few words, because people will just hear a little soundbite and you draw all sorts of conclusions. And that's fine. If you want to do that, feel free. Like I said, I'm just trying to be honest and transparent with you guys. I've never judged anybody harshly based on what they do or don't believe, at least not since my teenage years. I've seen too much of the world and too much nuance in the world to think that any one belief system has a corner on the truth market. However, I'm not some modern relativist either who believes that all truth is equal and by default all of it's equally worthless. I just think that I don't know enough to paint a picture. It's really, to use another cliche, scratching the tip of the iceberg. So for that reason, the podcast has never been something that was me trying to enforce dogma on you guys, trying to enforce a set of strict beliefs, but rather just to draw curiosity and attention to things that I think are timelessly intriguing, mysterious, and interesting. Things that ultimately point toward the big questions of life, but maybe don't answer them, but might, if nothing else, offer you a fresh take as you begin down your own path of trying to find those answers. That's all I've wanted to do in this podcast, make you ask bigger questions and arm you with resources to kind of send you on your way. Where you land, it's entirely dependent on you. I'm still on that path as well. So I've always preached this, but I hope nobody looks to me as somebody who's trying to show you a way toward a destination, because I'm also on the journey. And I don't know for sure that we ever arrive at the destination. But if there's one thing that I will get somewhat dogmatic or preachy about, it would be the thing that is not manipulated or controlled or orchestrated by human hands, because it's just an objective thing. It's not something that is really open to too much interpretation. Maybe there's interpretations that can be deduced from it, from its lessons, but it is not like a religion in the sense of human constructs. And that thing, if you haven't guessed it, is the natural world. It's the wilderness. It's nature. There's a freshness, there's a refreshingness that comes when you go back to the land, when you get in touch with the natural world. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness to do this. Meditation was actually very common in the Old Testament world. We, in the West, tend to kind of look at it with a suspicious eye because we see Eastern connotations of, yogis and gurus and people that, might try to use meditation or the yogic practices for personal gain. But it's really much simpler than that. It doesn't need to be that complex. I think yoga and meditation are beautiful things because what it does is it clears the mind. And the best place to do that is in nature, in the natural God-created world. You see it, when Isaac meets Rebekah for the first time. Abraham, his father, comes to him, and when he comes, he's meditating in a field. I think this is a good practice that we've gotten away from. This idea of just communing and just being at peace and at one. That's the key word, being at one with nature. So as I've been trying to do more of that in my own life over this summer, and it's been nice. We've gotten outside a lot. I went on a few hiking trips, spent some time in the Adirondacks hiking, which is one of my favorite places on earth. And fun fact, I think it's the oldest mountain range, or it's at least thought to be the oldest mountain range in the United States. So overshadowed, obviously, by higher peaks, but it's beautiful nonetheless and very ancient. As I was up there and as I was, spending a lot of time in nature here locally in the Poconos, I just saw nature kind of communicating with me in a still small voice, just showing me lessons, kind of like that voice on the wind that you don't really notice if you're not listening for it, but nonetheless, it's there. And what I'm calling these, and for the purpose of kind of putting some structure around this episode, I'm calling this the way of nature. What fundamentals or what lessons can we glean in this crazy, chaotic, fast-paced, materialistic world where everybody's going, chasing after their little piece of the pie in this amazing rat race of materialism? What can we glean from nature that's timeless, that's going to last beyond all of that, beyond all of our financial success and all of our personal glories and individual pursuits? What's timeless? And I've noticed, and I started documenting these things over the last couple of months, that nature has a lot to say if you'll just observe her. And I think if I were to sum it all up in one thing, I would use the words of the Greek lawgiver and philosopher Solon. Solon's the one who coined the term, all things in moderation. And if I had a religious philosophy, and if I ever start a cult or a religious group, that's going to be our entire motto right there. That is the entire creed, all things in moderation. Because if you can live by that, then I think you truly know what it means to live in accordance with nature. Nature is not a glutton. Nature takes what she needs, and sure, there are times of excess and there are times of little, but she always equalizes. There's never an extended period of time of excess in nature because there are systems and structures and organisms and ecosystems in place to make sure that that balance remains, almost like our human bodies. But all things in moderation. So I'm looking at nature through that lens. And through that lens of moderation, one of the first things you observe in the natural world is that it's universal and timeless. Energy cannot be destroyed. The natural world goes on, and it never ends. Energy can only transform. And this kind of feeds back into what we were talking about in the previous episode with metempsychosis, which, Pythagoras, who I kind of got the idea from, but it's purely observable to anyone who takes the time to look, is that nature teaches us that we have been here before and will be here again. Our consciousness may transform, but it cannot be destroyed. Neither can the atoms and the material that make up our body. We will be back here again in one form or another. Whatever that means, whatever that looks like, I can't say with certainty. But we can take comfort in the fact that nature teaches us that our energy will never be destroyed. Maybe this accounts for ghosts and ghostly apparitions. Maybe this accounts for memories of past lives. A lot of things I think could be explained by this. Another truth, just an empirical observation, is that nature can neither be good nor evil. By default, nature, whether we personify her as a woman, as Mother Nature, or as a father spirit, as some of the native cultures did, whatever human personification we want to put on it, the fact remains that nature cannot be evil, nor can it be truly good in the sense that we think of the word good. It's not indifferent either, though. Nature provides for her children. She gives us everything we need, and not too much more than what we need. But there is enough to make sure that every living creature on this earth does not want if we don't upset her systems. Can nature be abused? Yes. And when abuse comes in, evil can enter. But that's human abuse. The flow in us is a desire for excess. So the flaw within us as humans is this desire for excess. And that, by default, is to live apart from nature or against the law and order of nature. When we want excess, that means something else has to go without. You can't take more without somebody else receiving less. We see that, in nation states now, very wealthy versus very poor countries. Those who are resource rich are often doing better than those who are not, or those who can take the resources of those who would otherwise be rich do better. The reason is because not everyone can succeed equally if we want to live above our means. Abundance is an interesting word because nature gives us abundance in the sense that she gives us a plethora of things, options and varieties to choose from, but we cannot abuse them if we take more than we need. And this is where, the love-hate relationship with capitalism comes in. If we take more than we need for a profit to constantly, year after year, have to keep turning profits and churning that machine, it rapes and wreaks havoc on the earth. Because that's not the way nature lives. Nature doesn't do that. Nature's not constantly trying to outdo herself every year to make the profits and the rewards bigger and bigger. Nature is simply trying to live in equilibrium and trying to provide for all of her children year after year in cycles. We store up for the lean time and we have abundance in the summer, but we spread it out to make it equal across the year. This is what we can learn from nature. And it could impact our economic systems. It could impact our individual households if we would just acknowledge what nature teaches us about the true meaning of abundance. Another thing, and this one I touched on a lot in the last episode, but the thing that I think has been most transparent here in the Northeast for me over the last couple of years is how the seasons show us the cycle of human life. Every life has a spring, a summer, an autumn time, and ultimately a winter, time of death and dying. This is not a coincidence. I believe that nature has structured herself with these seasons, that God has structured nature with these seasons to show us a lesson that's often all too overlooked. Most of us live our lives as if the summer will never end. It's the life of perpetual summer. That would be the zeitgeist if I had to label it here in the modern American West. In the Western culture, and it's not just American, it's just a modern developed world, we live our lives and we consume media, we listen to music, we purchase material things as if we're going to live our lives in a perpetual summer season. And everything around us tells us that's just a lie. But as long as they can keep you believing it, you keep spending and you keep living frivolously. We have a spring. We have a summer. I'm living in my summer right now, and I've enjoyed my summer. I'm continuing to enjoy it. But I know that in years that will come much quicker than I'd like them to, I'll move into my autumn season. And I'll be prepared for that because I know it's coming. I'm living my life according with it now. And then ultimately I will move into a winter. And life would just be full of despair if it ended with winter. The last year for my family would be pure despair, and it has been tough. I wasn't shy about the things I went through last year. Again, I try to always be transparent and personal as much as is acceptable with my audience, because I want it to be, real and not just this simple, stale type of transaction where you download an episode and hear something you've heard before. I want you to kind of get to know me on a personal level. And I was not shy about how 2020 put me through the ringer personally and my family. Well, with all the death we've received over the last 12 months, on top of the personal things we were going through, you can imagine it wasn't a good time. And I thought a lot about death, especially over the actual winter months. But you know what the beauty of it is, and you know what gets me through, is that nature shows us that there is always, always new life, always a rebirth. This never ends. In 2012, people were leading up to the end of the Mayan calendar, the winter solstice, December 21st, 2012. Gringos all thought the world was going to end. And the media got a hold of it, I know, and made it kind of irrational. But it was never meant to be interpreted that way. The native peoples, the Mayan people, I should say, never, ever thought of humanity in that way. There's no linear trajectory of beginning and end. It's always cycles. Always. And why did they see the world in terms of cycles? Well, it's easy, because they lived in accordance with nature. We don't. In our modern world, and you can see this in our theology too, like in Western modern Christianity, this dispensational type of eschatology where, I named the podcast Eschaton sort of as a mockery of this, but this idea that everything's linear, that we're all just moving up to this inevitable end. Time at the end of itself is just picking up, and then you'll have this tribulation period, and then hellfire and judgment and rapture and blah, blah, blah. You guys know the story. That's a very modern, Western-minded ideology, because it's so foreign to nature. Any culture who lives in touch with God's creation knows that that's just absurd. That's not even remotely plausible as a way for a religion or a eschatology to unfold. The Mayans saw the end of a cycle coming in 2012, and it may take years for it to happen, but they saw it as the end of an era, which I think they actually hit spot on. We are moving into a digital world, a world that we had kind of been the bridge generation for between the 80s until the early to mid 2000s. But I was just talking to my wife the other day. You remember the old cell phones, the Envy and the Razor, or the Cellular One track phones, or the walkie-talkie Nokia phones, like all those things when I was in high school, were they were the hot item. Everybody wanted one of those. Well, look at how long it took to get from the giant brick handheld phone from the 80s that you had to plug in to get to that 25 years later. And then how long did it take to get from that to where we are now? In 10 years, we got versions of an iPhone that have more technology than a space shuttle. So we are definitely moving faster into a new age, uncharted territory as far as I can tell. And in that regard, I do think that the Mayans, in this secular view of the end of an age, the end of our world, so to speak, they hit it on the head. When did the first iPhone come out? 2010, 2011, somewhere around there? We are moving headlong into this new world. Constant surveillance, constant observation, no privacy whatsoever. A truly tyrannical state, just waiting for a tyrant to come and take things over. We're setting the stage for it. The world's going to be different than any of us have ever known it. It'll be smaller and more connected than it's ever been. We've touched on it, yes, but we're going deeper. And in that regard, I do feel like the world has ended in a way. And that's why so many of us are depressed. We haven't coped with it or recognized it. Many of us don't know how to operate in this new world. It will eat you alive if you're not careful. The seasons show us that nothing ends. Getting back to where I was in the cycles, there is hope of a rebirth. And maybe this world will end and the next one will be better. I don't know. It seems like we're going to a darker, more materialistic, more spiritually castrating type place, but there's always hope for a better tomorrow. And that's the beauty of this world, is that there's always hope for a better tomorrow. With every brutal winter, with every dying and dark season, there's hope of new life, and light comes again. It's not coincidental with creation. The beginning of Genesis, God says, "Let there be light." Well, it's in the solstice, the darkest day of the year, when winter hits us the hardest. But in the spring, the equinox in March, light comes back again. She fights her way back, claws up from the grave, and she's equal with the darkness. And then by summer, she's dominated the darkness. Let there be light. The language is intentional because the light within us doesn't die. Another fundamental that I've learned this summer, a way of nature, and I guess I've always kind of known this one, but I really haven't let it impact me and really flow through me or observed it in all of its nuance until this year, and that is that all things are connected and nothing happens in a vacuum. If you impact nature's ecosystem in even the smallest way, you can have cascading effects, something like a butterfly effect phenomenon, where changing one small thing can change everything. Like the example of taking the wolves out of Yellowstone. I remember watching a documentary on this a few years ago, and then I saw it again a few months ago, actually, back this past spring, and it's just profound how integrated and how interdependent nature's ecosystems are. But bringing back the wolves to Yellowstone a few decades ago transformed everything about that park. All sorts of flora and fauna came back that weren't there before, and it was like breathing in an entirely new ecosystem just by bringing back the wolves who had been hunted almost to extinction and entirely out of the area of the park. Well, nature's like this all over the place. If you allow the predators to run loose without controlling them, if man does not hunt them, if there's nothing else at the top of the food chain to hunt those apex predators, well, they can eat your livestock, they can eat certain animals, they can destroy certain things that will never recover. They'll be gone. It'll just take everything out of balance. On the flip side of that, if you kill all the predators, you get rid of the predators, then you have an abundance and excess of the prey animals, and they run rampant. Rabbits, for example, or deer. I mean, they can be extremely overpopulated. I'm a hunter, and I hunt deer every fall, and it blows my mind how many of them there are because they have no natural predators any longer in the Northeast. And with fewer and fewer hunters, you could do the math. There's a lot of these things, and that's because we've upset the ecosystem, the natural order of things. It goes back to Solon's point, all things in moderation. When we live in moderation, we live within balance. Everything stays on that pendulum, equal as it should be. Take only what you need and nothing more. In that same vein, I've learned from nature this year that life consumes life primarily for need and not for sport. I said a moment ago, I'm a hunter. Well, I hunt to fill my freezer. I don't hunt for sport. I mean, if I get a nice buck with a big rack, that's great. It's a trophy. But I use that meat. You better believe it. I don't waste it, and I don't kill anything that I don't intend to eat. Nature tends to be the same. Now, you could say, well, Josh, there's natural disasters and things that kill thousands and thousands of animals indiscriminately, and that's true. But in general, nature and her creatures only consume what they need, and things live with a balance. It's not a coincidence that for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, animals lived without threat of extinction. It was only when man started to industrialize and modernize that so many species went to the precipice of extinction. There are natural events from time to time. Take the dinosaurs, for example. But those things are so few and far between that you can't consider it a rule or a principle. The way of nature is that we consume only what we need. To take a life is a sacred thing, and life should be treated as a sacred thing. Nature teaches us that objectively. Nature also teaches us to balance our order with our chaos. These are the dueling spirits within us, the wolves within us, so to speak, the dark and the light, the yin and the yang, whatever you want to call it. It's a story as old as time itself. Chaos and order. Yahweh and Tiamat. Or perhaps I should say El and Tiamat, for those who distinguish between the two. But in any case, order and chaos are not to be worshipped in polarity. They're meant to be embraced equally. There are times in our life that call for order and organization, and there are times in our life that call for chaotic energy, raw, emotional, free energy. Run away from anyone who tells you that you always need to be reasonable, calm, orderly, because that's just not true. Humans were meant for chaos. We were meant to be emotional creatures and emotional beings. And when it's time for you to operate according to emotion, then just let it flow. Likewise, when it's time to operate with order and rationality, do the same. Nature does this. Storms are the perfect example of this. You can go from calm, tranquil, orderly to chaotic madness of a hurricane. or a torrential downpour in a monsoon, or a tornado, in a moment, in a blink. And that's okay. Nature, like us, was designed. You could say it's her emotions in one way or another, but nature was designed to balance the chaos with the order. Another thing I've learned, and I actually got this listening to another podcast not too long ago, a podcast called Ancient Civilizations, which I highly recommend. But there's an episode on the Aztecs. Fantastic episode. It's basically a mini audio book, but talking about the Spanish conquest, well, working its way up to the Spanish conquest and the destruction of Montezuma's Mexica or Aztec people, but starting before that with Aztec culture, something I did not know a whole lot about. And they were very much into the arts. We think of them of warriors and killers and sacrificial priests, etc. But there's so much more to their culture. You can't distill them to a stereotype like that, just like you can't with any modern culture. And they were very big into poetry and art, and they referred to anything beautiful or anything poetic as a flower, the flower within us. It's what we would call beauty or magisterial or our muse. They referred to it as the flower. And I like that term, so I'm going to use it. And I think that our flower is our legacy, what we leave behind after us. That's the flower in this world. And that's where I think art comes from. Nature's not foreign to this either. You can see it in the designs of her creatures, in the beauty of her natural monuments, the mountains around the world. That is nature's flower. That's her beauty. And we, likewise, were designed to have our own flower. Whether that be art that we create and leave behind for progeny, whether it be our children and the next generation we raise up behind us, or the structures that we build. Now, I have to be careful when I say that because I'm not referring to skyscrapers and giant monolithic buildings made of steel, but I'm referring to the way we organize our societies and the way we structure our communities. This is our flower. This is our beauty. And the thing about beauty is that it's universally recognized. I know there's a big push in the modern world to say all things are equally beautiful and beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but I've always thought that was bunk. Beauty is objective. It is not a subjective thing. Quality, arete, whatever you want to call it, is an objective, recognizable fact of nature. And because it's objective, we can also interpret that to mean that we don't need priests or intercessors to recognize nature's beauty or to hear nature's voice or to hear the voice of God, if you want to refer to it as that. We don't need priests. We are all priests. We are all nature's children. We're all free to engage with nature. You can go into the forest just as I can and recognize the beauty and the tranquility there. And nature is where God speaks to us in a still small voice. Nature is where the lessons of the universe are revealed to us. Well, that's by design, because it wasn't meant to be monopolized by one man or a mediary who was supposed to intercede on our behalf. It was meant to be observed by all. This is why Jesus took his disciples to the mountaintops and into the woods, so that they could recognize this truth. We have no need for priests. We have no need for intercessors or mediaries. We can all come of our own accord, and that's a beautiful thing. Nature shows us that. I've also learned this year just how precious life is. To take a life in vain is the ultimate sin, because life is such a rare commodity in this universe. And I think it's naive to believe that we're alone in the universe, but just on an observable, foundational, scientific fact, as far as we can see into outer space, we are alone. And for that reason alone, we should treat this world and treat each other with the utmost respect and awe and grace. Because we are all a rare commodity in this universe. If you zoom out your lens, you can observe it. We can all observe it. Life is a precious thing. To take life in vain is the ultimate epitome of ignorance. As a kid, I was never the child that stepped on the beetle for no reason. As far as I can recall, maybe I was at a really young age. I don't know. But I teach my kids not to be that either. And I know there's a darkness within us. There's this thing, this darkness, this shadow within us, whatever you want to call it, a sin nature, whatever it may be. But that thing that causes us to want to inflict harm, to want to usurp ourselves over others, and to want to destroy that ant or that bug or strangle that bird, that's darkness. That is not the way of nature. Nature wants life to succeed. Are there times that she doesn't? Yes, there are times when life does not succeed. But nature has created a way for life to exist, and that's no small feat. The fact that we're here at all is a testament that nature has made a way for life. And if life exists, then life is a precious thing, because the opposite of that is emptiness and void. And as far as we can tell, the stretches of the outreaches of the solar system are empty and void. And if they're void in the furthest reaches that we can observe, then we are all a miracle. One thing that I learned, and I've observed, perhaps the hardest lesson I've learned from being close to nature in these recent months, I guess you could say over a year now, is that nature shows that life is struggle. You can call it suffering if you prefer, but life nonetheless is a struggle, punctuated by suffering. We can go through periods of great success, great joy, great happiness, but when the suffering comes, it will make all of those things seem faint in comparison, because the suffering is so overpowering. When it hits you, it mutes the voices of all of the happiness and all the joy and all the peace and tranquility that came before it. And it's hard to remember those things in a positive light, because all you can think of in the moment is the suffering, the struggle. I've gone through a few of those in the last couple of years. We all go through a few of them, at least in the course of our lifetime, and some of us go through more than their fair share. But they sharpen us. They make us alert. They make us, I don't want to say stronger. I think that's too cliche and not true. But if nothing else, they make us aware of the constant fact, the reminder that life is not all about happiness and rainbows and warmth. It is about struggle and suffering, and hopefully overcoming those struggles, but nonetheless going through them. Why? That's $1 million question. I don't know. The prophet Habakkuk didn't know. As far as I can tell, the great prophets of most of the major religions don't have a corner on that market. They have answers, but you can be the judge as to whether or not those are satisfactory answers. All I'll say is that life is punctuated by suffering. To recognize that is a form of freedom. Another thing, perhaps just as potent and powerful, maybe one of the strongest lessons I've learned, is that the unseen world is more powerful and more present with us than the seen world. We can't see the atoms, the molecules, the air, the H2O, the oxygen. We can't see those molecules floating in the air all around us right now, but they're sustaining us much more than the physical world, the chair I'm sitting in, the house I'm sitting under. The invisible world is far more potent and far more powerful than the material observable world. The unseen wind can blow down the strongest man-made structure if the gust is strong enough. It can stir up a tidal wave. It can cause tornadoes and hurricanes. These all begin with an unseen force. And we do well to remember that we weren't meant to live for the material observable world. We're creatures of spirit, meant to live in the recognition of our own spirit and the spirits around us. I fail miserably at this every single day. And it's hard not to be honest with you, because to make a living, you have to be so engaged every single day with the material world, a world of clowns, a world of fluff, a world of nothing of actual staying power. But yet here we are, spiritual creatures reduced to material triviality. Going back to nature will fill your cup and remind you that you are a spiritual being meant for the invisible world, meant for invisible things that can't be observed with the human eye, and then to bring those lessons and those things back to the material world for the edification of all. But without going back to nature, you can't see those things. You'll just be consumed 24/7 with the material noise. And I've been there, and I'm still tempted to be there, more days than not, to be honest with you. But it's not a place you want to live. It only brings sorrow, sadness, and despair. And now for a lesson that I guess you could quote back to Blaise Pascal or a couple Renaissance-era philosophers, but the idea of the clockmaker, or the divine creator of the watch. Most of you are probably familiar with that metaphor from the philosopher Pascal, but nonetheless, nature teaches us the same lesson, which is that every design has a designer. You could trace this back to Aristotle, but I think it goes back to the first man who walked the earth. We all know that nothing happens by spontaneous combustion. Every piece of order in the universe had a prime mover, had a creator, every piece of art you've ever made, every piece of furniture you've ever seen, everything that has the mark of creation on it had an inventor or a creator. We are no different. Neither are the trees who have unique fingerprints. Neither is the beautiful water and the fish who swim in it, or the green grass. All of those things are forms of art. And that tells us that they have a designer. And this has been the lesson that's been most reassuring and comforting to me, is that no matter what the world tells us, no matter how loud it gets, no matter how many PhDs and academics align on one side of the aisle, they can sit and talk all night and say, there's no God, there's no evidence of a creator, we are alone in the universe. But in the morning, we're all going to find that they were wrong. Because every design has a designer. Nature tells us that. And when you're in nature, you can meet that designer. Or those designers, perhaps. I don't claim to know, but I do know that there's an intelligence behind us and behind this whole world. And that gives us peace. One final lesson, and this is the one I want to wrap with. I was sitting outside not too long ago, just looking at the structure of a tree. And I find trees to be like the most profound thing in the world. There's just so much to be gleaned from trees, and maybe this is why, the oldest story, the Garden of Eden, you have the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Or Midgard in Viking and Scandinavian lore is represented, by a tree with the branches in the sky being Asgard. Trees permeate religious imagery and culture from Kabbalah to Christianity. It's everywhere. And I think that one of the lessons, one of the strongest ones that have hit me anyway, is the lesson of the functions of the tree. You see, a tree has branches, and it has shoots that come off of those branches, creating leaves. It has a trunk, which is the foundation for everything. If you take down the trunk, the whole fortress comes down. And it has the roots, which feed the tree and provide it nutrients and stability. And if you don't have that, the whole thing will die and wither as well. What the tree has shown me is that it's a metaphor for every system that humans will function in this world, whether it be a company, an organization, a family unit, a religious community, a band of brothers, whatever you want to do to bring people together. They all have this same structure, and it's the structure of a tree. We all serve a different purpose, but we're all fed by the same source, and we're all tied to the same root system and that same trunk. And if they're damaged and if they're destroyed, all of us, the branches and the offshoots and the foliage, we all come down, all of us. And I think this is a critical lesson for our current moment in history, because a few blows have been swung, as far as I can tell, at the trunk of this tree. And there's some poison in the water that we've been drinking from in our roots. And if these things aren't addressed, the whole tree will wither and die. Going back to what I was saying earlier on in the episode about the natives and the Mayan idea of cyclical life, death, rebirth, well, the tree may die and maybe a new tree will be born from seedlings and the whole cycle will go on. But the tree that you and I are on right now is in jeopardy. And the way we keep this thing going is first by awareness, by realizing that we all draw from the same water source, we're fed through the same roots, and we all are dependent on the same trunk. That trunk being nature and what she provides. That root system being the content and the nutrients that we're feeding not only to our minds and our bodies, but to our souls and our spirits as well. In every aspect, we need to be healthy and aligned with nature. Otherwise, we will wither and die. In the whole ecosystem, you can see the rot forming in our tree right now from all of the junk. The Chinese recently called it opiate of the mind. And I think that's a phenomenal term. They were talking about video gaming and streaming online content and just modern pop culture. And they said they restrict it in their country because it's an opium of the mind. Basically, it just dumbs down the common folk. And I think it's too late for Western culture in that regard. Everything from Jersey Shore to the Real Wives of Timbuktu or wherever the hell, I don't care. All that stuff is just opium that dumbs us down until we're useless. And if we don't wake up and realize it, we're going to die like the frog in the frying pan. The water slowly being turned up on us until we're boiled alive. The lesson of the tree, the lesson that the trees have taught me recently is that we are the branches. We are the offshoots of legacies that have come before us. Generations before us were branches as well. Branches upon branches upon branches, a giant tree, all coming from the same trunk, which is fed by the same root. And our culture, our current zeitgeist, is poisoning the root system. And our modern technology, our modern inventions, you could use the nuclear weapon in 1945 as the ultimate example of this, is a blow that struck toward the trunk of the tree. And a few more blows like that one, and the whole tree, as I said, will come down. So if you learn nothing else from nature in this episode, and I hope you learn much from it, I hope you learn the lesson of the tree. Because we are one people, one race, one creation designed to be part of the same ecosystem. And if that tree comes down, what legacy do we have? Our flower will die with it. These are the lessons of nature. This is the way of nature that I've learned over the last few months. And I'm sure there's so much more it will teach me and more it will teach you. But I just wanted to share these ones that I've compiled so far. These are the fundamentals. And if I ever were to structure a religion or to structure an ideology, it would not be around dogma and ideals that man has invented, but around what can be gleaned just from the observable world. That's my faith. That's my religion, so to speak. And that's what I'm called to. And that's why I'm moving my family out into the middle of the country on an old dirt road to live on a farm, surrounded by wilderness where I can hunt my own land, where I can grow my own crops, raise my own cattle, my own chickens, sow my own seeds, and look up at a clear, starry Milky Way sky at night. Because that is what we were created to do. And I'll report back to you guys. And I'll let you know as I progress through it over the months and years ahead, what type of life it is compared to the life that I've been living, this corporate rat race kind of life in suburbia. And maybe a few of you will come join me, and maybe we'll start our own intentional community like we used to talk about in the early days of this show. And maybe we can find a better way to live for all of us, to share in the abundance of this earth and what it offers us, and not to live in excess, and not to live above our means, but to live within balance. All things in moderation. This is the way.